December 23, 1944. Mid-afternoon light settles over the Sonoran Desert outside Phoenix, Arizona. The air is mild, 68 degrees, but a young German soldier stands shivering at the gate of Camp Papago Park, his uniform stiff with dried mud, his boots worn thin by sand and rock. Offizier Vera Kraus has been free for 6 days. He has crawled through a tunnel dug by hand beneath an American prisoner of war camp. He has crossed 43 miles of desert on foot. He has watched rivers vanish into dust. He has rationed water until his mouth tasted of metal and his thoughts slowed to a crawl. Twice he came close to dying of thirst. Now he is back where he started. Not captured, not chased, not forced. He has returned voluntarily, standing quietly at the entrance, because something inside the camp has pulled him back more powerfully than fear or duty ever did. A single sheet of paper posted on a bulletin board. A Christmas menu. Roast turkey, mashed potatoes, 3 kinds of pie. For years, Vera had been told none of it was real. The food, the comfort, the photographs of America itself. As a guard steps forward to process his surrender, the question hanging in the desert air is not why he escaped, but why he came back. The answer begins long before this moment, in a war that carried thousands of German soldiers far from Europe into a country they did not understand. By the winter of 1944, the Second World War had scattered German soldiers across continents far from home. Not all were fighting. More than 370,000 German prisoners of war were being held inside the United States, spread across nearly 500 camps from Maine to California. It was an arrangement born of logistics rather than mercy. Britain's camps were full. North Africa was unstable. America had space, infrastructure, and food in quantities the Allies could barely comprehend. Camp Papago Park, located just east of Phoenix, Arizona, opened in May 1943. Surrounded by desert and distant mountains, it was designed to hold several thousand prisoners, most of them veterans of the Afrika Korps. These were not raw recruits. They were men who had fought Rommel's Desert War, Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, before surrendering to British and American forces between 1942 and 1943. U.S. Army chose Arizona deliberately. The climate resembled North Africa, the isolation reduced escape risks, and nearby farms, cotton fields, and orchards needed labor.
Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could not be forced to work, but most volunteered. Boredom was worse than labor. The pay was 80 cents an hour, issued in camp script usable at the canteen for cigarettes, candy, magazines, even beer. For American administrators, Camp Papago Park was a logistical success. It ran clean, it ran efficiently. Prisoners were fed 3 meals a day. There was a library, a theater, educational classes, even sports fields. For the prisoners themselves, this abundance created a problem. It did not match anything they had been taught to expect, and that contradiction planted a seed of suspicion that would grow quietly, month by month, until belief itself became the battleground. That suspicion would soon shape how the prisoners interpreted everything they saw, including America itself. Every German soldier arriving at Camp Papago Park carried more than a uniform and a serial number. He carried years of training in how to recognize deception. The Third Reich taught its soldiers that enemies used comfort as a weapon. Kindness was camouflage, abundance was illusion. A well-fed prisoner, they were warned, was easier to weaken than one beaten into submission. So when the meals were plentiful, suspicion followed. When newspapers arrived daily, printed in clean type and filled with reports of American industry and Allied advances, prisoners assumed fabrication. When Hollywood films played in the camp theater, musicals, comedies, dramas set in cities untouched by war, the audience watched not for entertainment, but for flaws. The logic was simple. No country fighting on 2 fronts could live like this. If America truly had this much food, this much fuel, this much leisure, then Germany was not losing battles, it was losing the war. That conclusion was unacceptable, so the prisoners reached for another explanation. Among the officers, this skepticism hardened into doctrine. Senior men, many of them career professionals, began meeting quietly to analyze camp life as a coordinated psychological operation. Everything was evaluated: portion sizes, paper quality, the tone of radio broadcasts, even the behavior of guards, who seemed more bored than hostile. Photographs in the camp library became a focal point. Images of vast highways, towering dams, and distant landscapes that looked impossibly large.
One photograph in particular unsettled them, a canyon stretching beyond the frame, carved in layers of red and gold,
with a river barely visible at the bottom. The officers concluded it could not exist. No natural formation could be that immense. The image had to be staged, designed to intimidate and impress. Hollywood, they reasoned, had the tools. America had the motive. This belief did more than preserve morale. It gave the prisoners a sense of control. If the world they were seeing was false, then escape was still meaningful. Freedom still lay somewhere south, beyond the wire, beyond the desert. And in the late summer of 1944, that belief would turn into a plan. The first angle was human, not strategic. Captivity stripped men of motion, but not of thought. Days repeated themselves with mechanical precision, and in that stillness, imagination filled the gaps. For many prisoners at Camp Papago Park, disbelief became a coping mechanism. Accepting the reality of American abundance meant accepting the scale of Germany's disadvantage. Doubt was easier than despair. The second angle was cultural. Most of the prisoners had grown up in a Europe shaped by scarcity even before the war. Meat was occasional, sugar was precious, coffee was rationed. In that frame of reference, American portions looked theatrical. Bread served without counting, butter left on tables, desserts that were not reserved for holidays. It felt staged because it had no equivalent in their experience. The third angle was moral. German military training emphasized endurance, sacrifice, and hardness. Comfort was associated with decadence. A nation that fed its enemies well seemed, on the surface, morally unserious. This created a paradox. Either America was lying, or it was operating under values so different that German assumptions no longer applied. Most prisoners chose the first explanation. Vera Krauss absorbed these ideas quietly. At 24, he was younger than many of the officers, less invested in ideology, but deeply shaped by authority. He had fought in France, then in North Africa, before being captured in 1942. He had learned to survive by trusting systems above himself. When senior officers explained that the camp was an elaborate performance, Vera listened. When they said escape was not only possible but necessary, he believed them, because if the comfort was false, then the world beyond the wire had to be real. That belief made action feel urgent.
And soon, skepticism would evolve into engineering. The fourth angle was tactical. Escape, in theory, was straightforward. The Mexican border lay roughly 120 miles south of Phoenix. Maps in the camp library showed rivers flowing across Arizona, blue lines suggesting movement, direction, and life. For officers trained in European geography, water meant certainty. Rivers could be followed. Valleys could be navigated. Distance, once plotted, became manageable. The fifth angle was environmental misunderstanding. The prisoners assumed Arizona behaved like the deserts they knew. North Africa had oases, seasonal flow, and established routes. Arizona, they believed, would be similar, harsh but navigable. They did not understand that rivers could exist only part of the year, that winter could still kill through dehydration, that empty space could stretch farther than endurance. The sixth angle was symbolic. The Grand Canyon photographs represented everything the prisoners rejected. Scale beyond comprehension. A land shaped by forces measured in millions of years. If the canyon was real, then America was not exaggerating its power or its wealth. It was merely revealing it. Accepting that truth would collapse the entire framework the prisoners had built to preserve dignity and hope. For men like Werner Krauss and Lieutenant Jürgen Wattenberg, the escape plan became a test, not just of fences and guards, but of belief itself. If the world beyond the wire confirmed their assumptions, then the Americans were liars. If it contradicted them, then something far more unsettling would be proven. By late summer of 1944, theory hardened into action. Dirt was moved by hand. Measurements were taken in silence. Night after night, the ground beneath Camp Papago Park began to disappear. The desert waited, indifferent. The tunnel began on August 19, 1944, beneath a shower drain in Compound 1A. Each night after final count, a small group of prisoners lifted the metal cover and descended into the darkness. There were no machines, no lights beyond what could be hidden. The work was done with improvised tools, hands blistered raw against Arizona clay. The tunnel was narrow, 2 feet wide, 2 feet high. Men crawled forward on elbows and knees, passing buckets of earth back in silence. The soil was darker than the surface sand, a problem solved with patience and ingenuity. The dirt was mixed with water,
blended into the volleyball court they had been permitted to build, spread thinly and smoothed before dawn. Guards inspected the court twice. Nothing looked out of place. Over 4 months, the tunnel stretched 178 feet. It passed beneath the perimeter fence and ended 15 feet beyond it. Canteen, a small food pack, and a compass fashioned from magnetized razor blades. 3 men carried something more ambitious, a collapsible boat, built in secret, intended for rivers that existed only on paper. At 22:30 hours, the first man entered the tunnel. It took 3 hours for all 25 to emerge into the desert beyond the fence. No alarm sounded, no searchlights moved. Camp Papago Park slept, unaware that its largest escape had already succeeded. In the darkness, the group split. Some headed west toward the Salt River. Others, including Vario Kraus, turned south toward Mexico. By dawn, optimism still held. By midday, the land would begin to answer back. The first riverbed appeared just before dawn on December 17th. Vario Kraus and his partner, Klaus Becker, found it exactly where the map said it would be, a shallow channel cutting through red earth. They knelt at the edge and stared down. It was completely dry. Not damp, not reduced. Empty. They walked on, convinced it was a mistake. By mid-morning, they reached a second creek. It too was dry. By noon, their canteens were empty. The temperature climbed into the low 70s, mild by desert standards, but warm enough to draw moisture from already exhausted bodies. Lips cracked, breath shortened. The land offered no correction, no explanation. Others reached the Salt River. 3 men unfolded their collapsible boat and stood in silence where water should have been flowing. There was only sand and stone. One of them began to laugh, the sound echoing strangely in the open space. The laughter carried a realization none of them said aloud, that if America had lied about rivers, it had no reason to lie about canyons. By evening, the escape was unraveling. Small groups turned back. Men collapsed beside roads.
Some flagged down passing vehicles. Others walked until they could not continue. The desert did not chase them. It simply waited. Verer and Becker reached a highway at sunset. They had been without water for hours. When a pickup truck stopped, the driver handed them a jug without hesitation. He told them Mexico was more than 100 miles away. He told them men died trying to cross that distance. The information was not delivered as warning or threat. It was practical, almost kind. They returned to Camp Papago Park less than 24 hours after escaping. Over the next 3 days, 19 of the 25 men surrendered voluntarily. 2 were hospitalized for dehydration. The last, Lieutenant Wattenberg, was found walking south along a county road and given a choice, ride back or die in the desert. He chose the ride. The escape had failed completely. But its most decisive moment came days later, when a Christmas menu appeared on a bulletin board, and one man realized he no longer believed the lie that had driven him into the desert. The tunnel was discovered on the morning of December 17th, when a guard noticed the shower drain cover sitting slightly out of alignment. Army engineers were called in to inspect it. They moved through the passage on hands and knees, measuring, photographing, taking notes. 178 feet, proper shoring, ventilation improvised with rolled paper, more than 300 hours of labor carried out without detection. For the camp command, the failure was technical, not ideological. Security procedures were revised, night inspections were added, counts became more frequent, work details were monitored more closely. Camp Papago Park would not be embarrassed again. But the prisoners were already undergoing a different kind of reckoning. The desert had contradicted everything they believed. The rivers on their maps had not flowed. Distances had not compressed with effort. Geography had not bent to will or training. The land means nothing for belief. It simply exists. When Vera Kraus saw the Christmas menu posted on December 23rd, the effect was immediate and disorienting. Roast turkey, mashed potatoes, 3 kinds of pie. The portions matched previous meals. The ingredients were familiar. Nothing was exaggerated. For the first time, the explanation that everything was staged felt less convincing than the alternative. The meal itself, served on December 25th, removed the last doubts. The food was real.
Freshly cooked, hot, shared by hundreds of prisoners, without ceremony or spectacle. There was no speech, no message attached. It was simply dinner. For many of the men, that realization was heavier than punishment. If the Americans were telling the truth about food, then they might also be telling the truth about everything else. And if that was so, then the war was not balanced on tactics or courage,
but on a difference in resources so vast it could not be bridged. That understanding reached the camp commander as well, and led to an unusual decision. In late December, Colonel William Holden reviewed the investigation reports and interviewed the escape leaders himself. He wanted to understand not just how the tunnel had been built, but why the plan had failed so completely. The answers were consistent. The men had trusted maps. They had trusted assumptions. They had distrusted every piece of information offered by their captors. During one interview, Holden removed a photograph from his desk drawer. It showed the Grand Canyon, taken from the South Rim. He asked Lieutenant Wattenberg if he recognized it. Wattenberg said he did. He had studied similar images in the camp library. He had dismissed them as fabrication. Holden told him the photograph was real. Then he made an offer that surprised everyone involved. In January 1945, a small group of prisoners, primarily those involved in the escape, would be escorted to see the canyon in person, not as a reward, not as punishment, as proof. On January 14th, 2 Army buses carried 23 German prisoners north toward Flagstaff. They ate lunch in a roadside diner, seated among civilians. No one stared, no one commented. The prisoners ordered hamburgers and soft drinks, served without hesitation. For some, it was the first time since capture that they had eaten in a public restaurant. That afternoon, they reached the South Rim. The prisoners stepped out and walked to the edge. The canyon opened beneath them, vast, layered, silent, more than a mile deep, miles wide. The river below reduced to a thin line of movement. No photograph had prepared them for the scale. Men stood without speaking. Some wept quietly. Others stared until their eyes ached. The theories collapsed all at once. No studio could fake this. No propaganda campaign would explain geology in billion-year timelines. This was not intimidation. It was reality. When they returned to Camp Papago Park that night, something fundamental had shifted.
The question was no longer whether America was lying. It was what it meant that it wasn't. That understanding would follow the prisoners home, long after the war itself had ended. The Grand Canyon, carved over millions of years by forces beyond human control, became a mirror for men who had spent years measuring truth in deception. For the German prisoners at Camp Papago Park, it was proof that abundance could be real, that generosity could be deliberate, and that power could exist without threat or coercion. Seeing it shifted perception more decisively than any battle ever could. Werner Krauss understood something in those minutes at the rim that no military textbook could teach. A nation capable of feeding its enemies, of preserving natural wonders, of maintaining dignity in both small and monumental acts, was a nation already winning. The war was not just fought with bullets and bombs, but with resources, with stability, with the quiet proof that some societies could sustain both strength and kindness simultaneously. When the prisoners returned home, when Werner eventually immigrated to the United States, those lessons endured. The desert, the tunnel, the dry rivers, the Christmas dinner, the vast canyon, all became a sequence of truths that outlasted ideology and fear. History is often measured in victories and defeats, but sometimes it is revealed in small, incontrovertible realities: a hot meal, a drink of water, a canyon carved in stone. In the end, the story of Camp Papago Park is not only about escape or capture. It is about the human capacity to discern truth, the fragility of belief under duress, and the quiet power of generosity. And it is about a country so abundant, so confident, that it could allow its enemies to witness the reality and live.